Hi, everyone. My name is Brett Singer. I'm a sports dietitian from Memorial Hermann Ironman Sports Medicine Institute, and today we're going to be talking about fueling the injured athlete. So a lot of times for any injury, we oftentimes will think of the orthopedic surgeon, we'll think of our working with our physician, our physical therapist, or athletic trainer, but actually nutrition can play a pretty significant role in your recovery and rehabilitation. So we want to touch on some of the basic things that you can take into consideration maybe the next time that you have an injury or if you're dealing with an injury right now. So the topics we're going to discuss, we're going to touch on the phases of injury nutrition, what some of the food considerations are, and then what some of the supplements are to consider. So first, we think of injury nutrition in kind of two phases, and these are a little more generic, but think of it as stage one being the immobilization phase, which is when you'll typically see someone who is non-weight bearing, who maybe has a cast or is on crutches or unable to strength train or put a lot of weight on their limb. Any time where they're at risk for losing a significant amount of muscle and strength. And so typically our goal as a dietitian is to help support the healing process here as well as minimize muscle loss. Those are some simple goals of ours. So we're going to touch on over the next few slides, what are some steps that we can do to help with both of those goals. So first I want to make a mention of some of the things that we might see related to an injury. So after immobilization occurs, so such as if you were in a cast, we see a pretty significant amount of muscle loss. So within about 5 days of being immobilized, you'll see about a 9% reduction in strength, and it's been shown to see about a 1.4% reduction in leg length mass, or in other words, muscle mass. We see a pretty significant amount of strength loss as well. So this is looking at after 7 days of being in a cast, how much strength is lost in several different leg-related exercises. So the first one is leg extension, which is where you're kicking your leg out. And they see a 19% reduction in strength within a week. And the leg press, which is almost like a squat, but on a machine, a 21% reduction in strength. On the leg curl, which is more of a hamstring dominant exercise, in that particular case is a pretty minimal loss, so only about a 4% reduction in strength. And then in the calf raise, is about a 9% reduction in strength. So we see pretty significant losses of strength and pretty significant losses of muscle mass when we have a limb that's immobilized, such as a leg. So how can we help resolve that? So one of the first things we need to consider is how much do we need to consume for food? A lot of times athletes will think, okay, well now I'm injured, so I should be consuming much less food because I'm not in my sport anymore. And that may not actually always be the case. So while you may not be doing as much physical activity related to your exercise, we also see a pretty significant increase in our energy expenditure, so the amount of calories that we burn at rest. And some of that's related to either the surgery that takes place or the inflammation that comes from the injury itself. We also actually expend a fair amount of energy if we're on crutches. So if you're having to move around on a large high school campus or a large college campus and you're on crutches, that requires quite a bit more energy compared to walking. So while our energy needs may be slightly less, they're typically not nearly as little as athletes may consider them to be. So the basic focal points here is that we want to keep our calories maybe a little bit lower by reducing our intake of carbohydrates and fats. So that's going to be things like grain-based foods like breads and rices and pastas and fruits and starchy vegetables and sweets and sodas and candies, or our fat-based foods, which is going to be more of our butters, our fatty meats, nuts, seeds, etc. Maybe a slight reduction in the portion size of these items would be helpful, but we don't need to drastically reduce them and we don't need to avoid them either. The goal here is going to be energy balance and weight maintenance. In other words, we don't want to gain a lot of weight. We don't want to lose a lot of weight. Typically what we see is when we gain a significant amount of weight because we eat too much calories after an injury, not only does that result in excess body fat gain, which can potentially hinder performance or our ability to bounce back, but we also see a pretty significant acceleration of muscle loss. So now because we overconsume, we actually see an acceleration of muscle loss related to that. And on the other hand, athletes who decide that they're going to undereat in fear of gaining weight Now what we see is if we lose too much weight and we eat far too few calories, we see a pretty significant acceleration of muscle loss overall. So what we want to do is kind of find that sweet spot. So we want to make sure that we're not losing too much weight and we're not gaining too much weight either. Okay, so some simple protein goals is going to be the next talking point. So while we want to try and find a maintenance zone of how much we're eating in total, protein's the really big focal point here. We want to make sure that we're getting adequate protein during the day. So we think of it as three simple T's. So we think of it as total, timing, and type of protein. And we're going to go over what those mean in just a second. So why we want this is because we know that when a limb is immobilized, so if we're not able to do physical activity, our muscle becomes a little less responsive to the protein that we feed it. So you'll actually need higher amounts of protein now when you're injured compared to when you're physically active. Because when you're exercising, when you're doing weightlifting, when you're running, our muscle is much more sensitive and responsive to protein that we eat. So when we're less active, it's a little less responsive and we need more protein to overcome that negative response. So a simple reminder is to focus on protein first. So what that means is when you have your meal, let's say we had chicken and pasta and vegetables, don't focus so much on the pasta and the vegetables first. Instead, focus on the chicken first. So we know that oftentimes our appetite tends to go down early on after an injury. So we want to focus on protein and make sure that we absolutely get that amount of within our needs. And then if we still have the appetite for it, now we incorporate our starches, our vegetables, and other items as well. If we find that you're really struggling to get enough protein through foods alone, then supplement may be necessary. So we have whey protein supplements that could be of benefit to you if you're unable to consume it through food alone. So without getting too into the science, just a couple quick highlights here. So we know that muscle may be in need of greater amounts of protein after an injury. So here what they did is in this graph to the left, they had two different studies in which they looked at individuals laying in a bed for 7 days. So what we're trying to do here is simulate the effects of what you might see after an injury. And what they found is with the higher protein intake, the group that took in more protein wound up losing about 1 kilogram less lean mass. In other words, about 2 pounds less lean mass was lost when they consumed higher amounts of protein. So we do believe that consuming higher amounts of protein can help preserve muscle, which should hopefully mean that you're a little bit closer to your starting point by the time you finally start to rehabilitate. So now we're getting back into action a little bit quicker, hopefully. So we typically want to aim for about 20 to 40 grams of protein at each feeding. That's a really simplistic way of looking at it. So breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snacks, try and make sure there's a protein source in there. It should probably be about 20 to 40 grams of protein. So a simple way to think of this, we often will describe this almost like a brick wall. So if you were to think of your muscle like a brick wall and every one of those bricks being made of a protein, what happens throughout the day is you'll see that you have one person who breaks down the wall or helps break down muscle. And we have another person that helps add bricks to the wall, or in other words, adds new protein to your muscle. So what happens here is when we go through an injury, we don't get the same response as normal. So in a normal, healthy situation, what occurs is when you have a meal that has protein, then for the next several hours, that brick builder is going to add more bricks to the wall than you lose. Or in other words, the size of the wall gets fractionally larger over that few hour span. So in another simple way of looking at it, our muscle gets a little bit larger during that period of time. Okay, but if we go through long periods of time where we're not eating any food, well, then what happens there is we're not really adding much bricks to the wall in that scenario, but we're continuing to break bricks down from the wall, meaning that our muscle gets fractionally smaller during that time. Now, when you have an injury, what happens is it's almost as if our brick builder becomes a little bit more selective. So you provide him with protein and he adds less of those bricks to the wall than normal because he's a little more selective with his choices. So what we want to do is provide him with more options than normal. So we want to provide more protein than normal during an injury. So that way he has more options or more bricks to include into the wall. And hopefully we lose a little less muscle mass during that. So that's kind of a simple way to look at this. So if we were to lay it out throughout the day, then this would be a way that we could do it. So we might have a little bit of eggs for breakfast, maybe chicken for lunch, salmon for dinner, and maybe some sort of protein-based options for our snacks. So perhaps a smoothie in the morning, cottage cheese in the afternoon, and maybe even a protein shake in the evening. Now, each of these are really simplistic views, images, so this doesn't depict what a whole meal should look like by any means, but simply just emphasizing that we want to incorporate protein in each of our feedings throughout the day when we have an injury. The quality of protein also matters as well. So a lot of times you'll have athletes that will say, well, I had nuts for a snack, or I had quinoa for lunch, or I had a peanut butter sandwich. These items may have protein, but they may not have as much protein as you realize, and they may not have quite the quality of protein that we're looking for. So we think certain amino acids or building blocks of proteins are more important than others in our response. And we think leucine is a pretty key amino acid here. So generally, a lot of times you'll hear about 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine, the sweet spot that we're looking for. Well, when we look at that, here's a few different examples of protein sources and how much it would take to get to that amount of leucine. So if we look at something like whey protein or chicken, it may only take a small portion or a few hundred calories worth of food in order to get to that amount of protein that we need to get the absolute best response. But if we look at something like bread right there in the middle of the image, well, in that particular case, it requires about 3,500 calories worth of bread in one meal to get the amount of leucine that we need. Or if we were looking at something like nuts or nut butters, again, same thing, may require as much as 800 to 1,000 calories or so within one meal to get the amount of protein and the amount of leucine that we need to get the positive response we're looking for. So the point of this image is just simply to highlight the fact that certain protein sources may be more impactful than others. And so things like whey protein, milk-related proteins such as milk, yogurt, kefir, cottage cheese, meat such as chicken or fish, turkey or beef, eggs, yogurts, these types of protein sources can be really high quality protein sources that we want to integrate into our diet in order to help make sure that we're getting not only the right amount of protein, but the right types of protein. That we may want to consider a few different protein or a few different supplement options. So one would be whey protein, which we've already referenced. About 20 to 40 grams of protein in a meal or a snack is appropriate during this early phase of injury recovery. And so if you can't get that through food alone, then whey protein may be an effective tool you utilize. Omega-3 may also be a supplement that's worth considering. So omega-3 will be found in fatty fish, certain nuts and seeds as well. However, it's typically hard to get to quite this amount of omega-3 unless we're consuming fatty fish on a pretty consistent basis. So omega-3 supplementation may help. We find that it may help almost sensitize our muscle to the responsive protein that we consume. So we find that during this phase of injury recovery, omega-3 may be of benefit. Now, typically it takes a few weeks to get the full benefits of omega-3. So if it's possible to supplement ahead of time before any sort of significant surgery, before an injury takes place, then we may want to do that in preparation just in case. Now, oftentimes surgeons will ask you to not or to refrain from omega-3 supplementation for the final few days prior to surgery. So you do want to talk with your physician to try and make sure that you're okay to continue, or if you need to refrain from taking it at some point. Creatine monohydrate is a safe and effective supplement that can be utilized. We would typically recommend about 5 grams daily. There are other strategies on how you can potentially take it, and a dietitian will work with you on those certain ways and what that may be. Creatine may help preserve muscle mass after an injury during mobilization, but it may also help, or we know it can help, with building strength and muscle later on once the rehabilitation phase takes place. Hydrolyzed collagen is a popular supplement that you'll typically see nowadays. Really isn't all that beneficial for muscle, but it can be potentially helpful for ligament and tendon healing and bone healing as well. So in these particular cases, you may want to take about 15 to 20 grams of collagen about 1 hour prior to therapy-based activities. So if you're going in for physical therapy, or if you have home activities that you're trying to do, that might be a supplement that you would consider about 1 hour prior to activity. And a general multivitamin may also be helpful to just ensure that you're getting adequate nutrients that you need in your daily diet. If you're going to take a supplement, you want to make sure that you're taking a supplement that's been third-party tested. So what this means is that there's always some risk of banned substances being within supplements. And so these outside parties can or will test supplements to ensure and to verify there's no banned substances in it. So the two most commonly used ones that you'll see are NSF Certified for Sport, which is the label in that top right-hand corner, and Informed Sport, which is the label just below it, so the yellow one right there. Both of these will be found on the front of products. They help verify that there are no banned substances within the product. So if you were to take a protein or an omega-3, generally I would recommend that it have one of those two labels most commonly. And again, a sports dietitian such as myself or my colleagues here can help you with that process if you're looking to identify a potential supplement of interest. So a few simple questions that you can ask yourself to help identify if maybe it's a good time to work with a dietitian would be, how is your appetite on a scale of 1 to 10? So if your appetite is quite low and you're not able to eat much food, then we know you're at greater risk of losing muscle and strength. And so a dietitian can help with that process. And we also know, again, that we lose a pretty significant muscle mass in a very short period of time. So the earlier that you can consult with a dietitian, the better. How many meals are you having each day? So if you're only eating once or twice a day, then we know we're not achieving that goal of consuming protein frequently throughout the day. So that would be a potential issue. What percentage of your meals are you able to finish? If you're only eating maybe 20% of your meal or half your meal, again, you may be at risk for underfueling. And again, you may be at risk for greater loss of muscle and strength. What types of protein sources are you having at your meals? Are they the right types of protein sources? And if not, then maybe we need to focus on adjusting those. Who's doing the grocery shopping and food preparation at home? So if you're an adult or a college athlete, the concern is if you're having an injury, are you able to get to the grocery store, or are you able to move around within the kitchen and prepare food for yourself? If you're struggling to do those things, then that likely means you're struggling to get enough food on a daily basis, and that's obviously an issue. So if you're in a scenario where you may not be able to prepare food for yourself, what are some of the solutions that we can come up with for that? And then lastly, are you currently consuming a supplement? There's a few different supplements that may be very advantageous for you after an injury. And so certainly asking that question would be helpful. And if you're not, or if you're unsure, then consulting with a dietitian may be helpful. So in summary, for this particular phase, we want to focus on maintaining energy balance. We may need to reduce our carbohydrate and fat intake just a little bit, but we don't want to eliminate either of these items. We should consume about 20 to 40 grams of high quality protein every 3 hours or so, including prior to bed. We want to incorporate plenty of fruits and vegetables in our diet because we want as much color in there to help support our recovery process. 3 to 5 grams of omega-3 might be a beneficial supplement to consider for helping preserve muscle mass. And then for adults, for those over 21, we want to try and avoid alcohol. Alcohol suppresses our muscles' response to protein, which would further increase the risk of loss of muscle mass. So the image in the bottom right-hand corner is a great depiction of what our plate should look like during this particular phase. This is called the athlete's plate, which is developed by the US Olympics. In this particular case, it shows you a plate. About half the plate is made up of color, and we have a pretty significant portion, so maybe a 25% to a third of our plate should be made up of some sort of protein source. And then we still want to integrate some sources of carbohydrates in there, but because we're very limited on activity, we may not need quite as much as when we're training on a consistent basis. So the recovery stage or the rehabilitation phase is going to be a little bit more of a short talking point. So a lot of the same things that we just discussed still apply to some extent. But in this particular case, now we're talking about an athlete that's starting to return to play. They're starting to incorporate resistance training. Maybe they're doing more strenuous physical activity. Now we know that they're increasing their energy expenditure through physical activity. And the focal point here is supporting those energy needs, increasing muscle growth and strength to help support the recovery and return to play. So here our energy needs are going to increase a little bit. So now we know that we're doing more physical activity. We may need to gradually incorporate carbohydrate intake to support activity. Especially want to emphasizing the timing of the energy intake around our physical activity and therapy. So if you're a high school athlete going into therapy, either in your athletic training room or with your physical therapist, consuming carbohydrates or a snack before you go do your training, and especially after your training as well to help recover, is an important component. What we don't want to do is skip lunch and skip the afternoon snack and then go into therapy and not give it our best effort. So you want to make sure that you're having some sort of snack before and after activity if it's going to be a lengthy period of time before dinner occurs. Okay, when it comes to protein, now your protein needs actually decrease a little bit. We still want to incorporate protein in each meal, but it may not mean quite as much in this particular scenario because now you're doing physical activity. Our muscle is much more sensitive to the response of protein, and so we may not need quite as much. And again, a dietitian can help work with you on how much and what type of portion sizes that you may need, depending on your activity level and the size of the athlete, etc. So those are really some simple things to consider when we're talking about our diets and supplementation when we have an injury. If you have any questions at all, these are my contact information. So this is my email address if you need to reach out to me directly. This is my social media handle for both Twitter and Instagram. On both of those accounts, I post a fair amount of nutrition content, all sorts of different ideas and handouts and topics if you're interested in that area. Thank you so much for sitting down with me and listening about injury nutrition today. Please let me know if you have any questions at all. Thank you.